Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and I am the host of Life Along the Merrimack. This is a podcast that talks about the river, its people, some of the activities that are going on, and also some of the future of the Great Merrimack River, which is why a lot of people who are listening to this probably live here, a great affection for the natural arena that we have here. My guest today is Mike Morris, who is chairman of Storm Surge. This is a nonprofit organization here in the Newburyport area that looks into environmental issues with the ocean, with erosion, with climate change. And for about 5 years, they have been monitoring the situation. They're aware of things nationally, and they're also alert to things happening at the local level. So, Mike, welcome to the show, and thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for having me today, Doug.
You started about 5 or 6 years ago with Storm Surge, and it may have been, after one particularly deadly winter, and we had a good bit of erosion in several of those winters. Can you talk about how the organization started and kind of what your mission is?
Sure. So many moons ago, when my wife was a selectman for the town of Newbury, I want to say that was back in about 2005, that's when the erosion really started to accelerate on Plum Island, and it was a big mystery surrounding as to why it was happening. And so there were some meetings that started to take place, sort of the formative meetings of what would become the Merrimack River Beach Alliance. And she sat in on those as a selectman and came home one night and said, I don't really understand what's going on in these meetings. It seems like a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about what's happening. She said, could you sit in on one of them? Because I do have a background in oceanography and meteorology. And so I did. I sat in on a meeting, and I came out of it and said, yep, nobody knows really what's going on, but they're already embarking on a solution to fix the problem. So I know from my background that you can't fix things that you don't really understand. Mm-hmm. So I did a survey of the shore, uncovered some interesting things. Didn't appear that the sand was flowing in the direction that everybody thought, and started looking at some of the historical changes of Plum Island, dating back all the way to nautical times, looking at nautical charts, and sort of discovered that there's a 50 to 100-year cycle where the new point comes and goes, and the river mount changes its position. And effectively, we've sort of held it in one spot by putting the jetties in. Anyway, long story short, my effort in that area led to some public presentations of my results. And so I became involved and known for understanding what was going on at Plum Island. So in 2012, 2013 winter season, we kicked that off with Hurricane Sandy, and then we had 4 additional really high-energy coastal storms, not necessarily a wintry season, but a lot of wave energy. And that's where we had some houses fall in. And there was a panic response to the last storm in March, where all the granite got dumped on the beach. And so Storm Surge evolved out of that emergency response to that storm event. And the people that founded the group invited me to participate because of the background I had. And basically, what our goal has been since we started was to get communities to understand what climate impacts would be, and to develop some long-range plans in adaptation so that they're not reacting to the emergency every time it happens.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the jetties, and of course, there was a northern jetty, the southern jetty, right, each for about $10 million, I'm thinking. What is your sense of that? Now, the Army Corps of Engineers said their mission on that one was to improve navigation in the river, and they, kind of, I'd say, sloughed off questions of the erosion. How do you feel the jetties have affected Plum Island and Salisbury since they've been put in?
Well, there's no doubt that they're implicated in what's happening along both beaches, because basically they're man-made structures. They interrupt the natural forces and flow of sediment around the inlet. And they're artificially holding the inlet in one place. The inlet, as I mentioned before, likes to wag its tail. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's to the south, sometimes it's to the north. But some unfortunate things happened. Back in the days when the jetties were built, Newburyport was a big shipping harbor, a lot of commerce, clipper ships coming in and out. And the sandbars in the river caused a lot of ships to run aground and lose their cargoes and so on and so forth. So the jetties were established to basically keep the river mouth in one place. And the idea was that they were going to narrow the river mouth and increase the current velocity and cast this nuisance sand out to sea. But what they ultimately discovered was all they were doing was chasing that delta bar further and further out, and they never actually got rid of it, right?
Boaters even today complain about it, and the veteran boaters are quite careful because, as you say, it can move from side to side or back and forth.
But that's the nature of an inlet. An inlet has a sandbar at the delta, and every inlet in the world has that. It doesn't matter if it's jettied or not. And, it's different than going in and out of a harbor, for example, where you don't have as much current and no sediment being, deposited by the river where it enters the ocean. So, the two jetties basically act as bookends to the beaches. They're known as terminal groins, is what coastal geologists will call it. And ultimately what they're trying to do is keep the sediment from flowing into the river and making it shallow. And they do a good job of that when they are intact. And what has happened when we attached the South Jetty to Plum Island is that the shore actually grew wider because the sand flowing north, trying to get into the inlet, accumulated behind the jetty and just stacked up like cars on a traffic jam, right? So it made Plum Island Point a lot bigger than it would naturally be. And of course, we filled that entire area with houses. And every time the jetty falls into disrepair and that sand can start migrating back into the river, then the shoreline retreats to where true mean high water wants to be. And of course, then it encroaches upon houses and, we have conflicts.
Well, one of the curious things that happens is Newbury frequently gives out building permits to put houses in very close to the water. In fact, in several plots, they're replacing houses that were lost to storms. On the other hand, Newburyport isn't quite as close to the ocean, but, school children will frequently plant dune grass and whatever. So it's always been curious to me. On one end of the island, you may have backhoes coming in and digging out a plot for a house. On the other end, you're having school children put in dune grass. Is this an unusual situation?
Well, there's certainly a contrast, right, between how the two communities are approaching this. But it's not unusual, I guess I would say, from any other barrier island. I mean, basically, you have conflicts here, right? A town does not necessarily want to curtail development because that's their source of tax revenue, right, to support their functions. So there's not a huge incentive for Newbury to say, you can't build here. The other side of it is, we have homeowners' rights, and we have people now on Plum Island who are fairly wealthy homeowners and have a lot of legal resources. The town doesn't want to get hauled into court to challenge things. And so what we have is a situation where people rebuild in places where maybe 3 times before historically the same house fell in the water. So that's a problem, and it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to happen in the future, especially as sea level rises and storms get stronger. Now in Newburyport, Storm Surge, the group, has had a bit more leverage, and we've got the ear of Donna Holiday and various departments in the city. And we're in the process of developing a climate resiliency plan for the city. When I say we, that's a committee formed by Mayor Don Holiday, and I'm co-chair of that committee. And so, we're casting our eye to the future, and we're trying to preserve, let's say, our time on Plum Island, but do it in such a way that we don't destroy the resource in the process.
Well, it seems like she's been activist on this. As you say, there is a resiliency group, there's Storm Surge. There are other groups that are looking into this. We've talked about the ocean. Does your group talk about the river? The river may be rising. Certainly Cashman Park, it's flooded. And I ask this question in the context of there's a large construction project on the books, Waterfront West.
Right.
And a newcomer might say, "Gee, that looks like low-lying area. Are you going to put 200 condos there and 100 hotel rooms?" Has this come up? I mean, are people concerned that water rising in a low area might be of concern in the future?
Sure. In developing the resiliency plan for the city, and we're looking at sea level rise maps, we're looking at flooding maps, and it's definitely a risky thing to be building in what is currently a FEMA flood zone, because that zone is only going to get deeper as time goes on. And so, unfortunately, part of the whole resiliency plan is that we need to start creating overlay districts and things like that, and some different criteria for building within a flood zone, which doesn't exist right now. So projects that are looking to be developed today are going to move forward under existing rules. So that's one of those catch-22s. We know that it's a risky project, and we're trying to encourage, or I should say the city has tried to encourage the developer to really account for climate change and sea level rise in their project, so that the project is best protected, as is possible. The conflict too with, again, is a developer has a window from which they want to build a project, sell all their condo units, lease out all their restaurant space or whatever. That's maybe a 2 to 5 year window, right, from breaking ground to having it all done. The city, on the other hand, is like, okay, we put a building in, it's probably going to be here 100 years. I mean, heck, we've got buildings in town that are 300 years old, right? So we look at it from the perspective of, okay, in 100 years, when it's not unreasonable to think that sea level rise is going to be 3 to 6 feet higher, where's that project sit? And is it going to be a habitable spot, or is it going to be an empty building that the city's got to figure out how to tear down? And that's an issue.
Well, this is Dyke Hendrickson. I'm the host of Life Along the Merrimack. My guest is Mike Morris, who is chairman of a nonprofit group called Storm Surge, and they are kind of monitoring, looking in on environmental effects along the ocean and the river. In the old days, Mike, there used to be state money for cleaner water and for projects, and federal money. When we're talking clean water, I remember the old days of Senators Muskie and Mitchell of Maine, who got a Federal Clean Water Act going in the early 70s. Some people are concerned now that there's so much rain in short bursts as a result of climate change that the sewage treatment plants overflow, and sometimes they have to let sewage out along with the rainwater. Is this a concern to you, and is there a way of slowing down or improving this situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a concern to me personally as a surfer, for example. I mean, I remember surfing at Plum Island, coming home and taking my wetsuit off and having a rash. And I'm like, where did that come from, right? And so obviously, some days the water's cleaner than others, and you don't have to really test it to know, you just kind of see it actually. And so yeah, it is a concern. Certainly the situation or the design of the stormwater and wastewater treatment systems all flowing into one is a problem, because as you said, during heavy rain events, which we are now seeing more often, and that's the trend, you're going to see more sewage overflows because the plants can't handle the storm water plus the sewage at the same time. So as a result, we're going to see compromises in water quality. But there are obviously some unknowns here. The sewage plant operators will argue, well, the amount of water that we're dumping into the Merrimack relative to all the rainwater that's coming down the Merrimack from natural sources is really a fraction, and hence it doesn't affect water quality. But really, we don't have testing, and we don't have a testing schedule to really understand what's going on. In other words, sitting down here on Plum Island Point, if you're putting your toe in the water and you're curious to know, is the water safe? The state comes in and tests it every Tuesday at a certain time. Doesn't matter what the tide is, or it has no correlation to when there was a CSO that happened upriver. So you could be testing it on a day on the incoming tide when it's mostly ocean water and you get a nice clean reading. Or you could be testing it on a day that's a day sooner than when the effluent's going to be arriving down at the mouth of the Merrimack. So this sort of thing needs to be figured out. A, is there really a problem with water quality? It certainly sounds like there is, but we don't know scientifically whether there is or not. And so there needs to be a water quality monitoring program, and that needs to be developed, and we need to determine, like, when there's a surge release in Merrimack or Nashua, how long does it take to get to Newburyport? And those are the kinds of answers we don't have yet.
Well, I went to an event last week hosted by the Merrimack River Watershed Council, and it was in Manchester, New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. Now, the Merrimack River is 120 miles long, right, and it goes deep into New Hampshire. And I think the reasoning of the Watershed Group is, we've got to get Manchester on board here, sure, because Manchester is one of the largest emitters into the Merrimack River. It's a very large city. And it's going to take two states, people in two states, to work on this problem. So I think they felt that they want to get more buy-in from the New Hampshire communities as well as some of Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. Right. Does that seem like that would be a useful idea to try to get everybody on board? Sure.
I mean, it's got to be a cooperative measure. I mean, you got to get all of the wastewater treatment operators and players on the same page and trying to deal with this problem. So, yeah, I mean, at some point, pressure's got to come from the federal level and also some funding. And it's certainly not going to be a problem that's solved overnight. I mean, when you start to think about the size of a city like Manchester and trying to separate stormwater from sewage systems, you're talking about a lot of digging up of streets and laying of pipes and things like that. In the interim, there are other strategies that could be employed, but again, it's not something that's going to get solved overnight. You can start with strategies to reduce the amount of wastewater that's generated by low flush toilets and stuff like that. But even that's a huge retrofit in every household, mm-hmm, within a city. But certainly a testing program and an alert system to let people know who use the river whether it's safe or not is probably the first line of defense. But yeah, it's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon because it's such a huge infrastructure project and it'll cost billions of dollars. But I think I had the statistic at one time, I don't recall it right now, but it's basically the equivalent cost of about 3 of those fancy fighter planes that the Defense Department's buying would solve the problem for the Merrimack.
That's a good corollary, good analogy. Can you talk, Mike, a little about, your growing up in the area? You mentioned you were surfing. Did you fish as well? And, was this a good time for the ocean? And, I wouldn't say every day was a lark, but I'm assuming you wore a wetsuit every time you went in. Talk a little about your early life near the waterfront.
Yeah, sure. So we moved here back when I was in 8th grade. So I went through the middle school and high school in Newburyport. I started surfing when I was 11, and we used to frequent Seabrook Beach a lot when we lived up in southern New Hampshire. And then, of course, since we relocated to Newburyport, then Plum Island was the beach that I would typically go to. Back in the old days, the wetsuits were pretty horrible. They were very thick and clumsy, and they leaked a lot, so they really didn't keep you as warm as they do today. But I've certainly seen, changes, some for the good, and also some not so good. Back when I was a young child walking on Plum Island, I remember my dad taking me home at the end of the day, and he'd sit me down with a can of paint thinner to take the tar off the bottom of my feet, because back in those days when people changed the oil in their boats, it went right into the Merrimack. So that all stopped in the mid-'70s through federal regulations. So the river got cleaned up in that regard. You don't see tar balls in the rack line on Plum Island anymore. But, I've seen the collapse of the fisheries. I've witnessed that firsthand. My dad was a charter boat operator, and I used to crew with him until I went away to college. And I remember what we used to catch and what you catch today, and it's just no comparison. And then, I also listened to my grandfather, who was in the business as well. And so, you see your grandfather talk about catching cod that are 5 and 6 feet long, right, to when I fished, a big cod would maybe be 3 feet long, and we'd catch 1,000 pounds a day just jigging cod on Jeffrey's Ledge with a 6 passenger charter boat. Nowadays, you go out, if you catch 3 fish and they're about a foot long, you're lucky.
Well, I went out a couple years ago with Charo's boats out here on Plum Island, and there were 40 people on the boat, and we caught 2 fish of 40 fishermen.
Yeah.
And that's 2 blues, I think it was.
Yep.
And I don't know, when you have 38 people leaving the ship and nobody caught anything,
Yep.
I think everyone is kind of looking around and as if to say, have the fish disappeared, or did we just come here on a bad day?
Some of it's, some of it obviously is overfishing and mismanagement of the fishery here in New England. I mean, part of the problem with our fishery is it goes back to colonial times, right? It was a free-for-all. People could catch as much as they wanted, and it's always been that way. And so establishing quota systems and that sort of thing has always been difficult. Whereas the fishery in Alaska, where I have uncles who fish salmon and halibut up there, that fishery right from the get-go was driven by fisheries management biologists. They knew how many fish could be caught and how many needed to stay in the water, and everything was set up that way. Fishing for halibut was a 3-day season, and you go out and catch as many as you can in 3 days, and at the end of that, that's it. What it did for the Alaska industry was it drove up the price of fishing licenses. So if you were a captain and you wanted to retire, well, your license was worth $100,000 to $200,000. So that was a source of equity for yourself and of course your boat. And the fishery is sustainable. They have plenty of fish, plenty of large fish and mature fish. So what we have in New England, unfortunately, is the opposite of that. We've got everything fished out to unsustainable levels where the populations aren't large enough to reproduce at the volume they need to. And then on top of that, now we've got ocean waters warming, and the species are just relocating out of the waters entirely. So, the fishery's having a tough time on a number of different fronts.
I think one success story in the last decade or two, however, has been the striped bass.
Right.
About 2 decades ago, perhaps a little longer, they started putting limits, almost 30 inches, on a bass that you could actually take home, and also limiting the number that you could take in the vessel. And my understanding is the striped bass has come back pretty well, in large part because of these thoughtful regulations.
Well, that's, they incorporated science into fisheries management, right? So they understood that striped bass don't lay eggs until they're 36 inches long. So if you're catching fish under that size, they never get to make baby bass.
Good point.
And so they basically put a moratorium on catching the small fish for, I think, about 3 years, and it didn't take very long for them to rebound. And of course, they've brought the size down now because they know that there are enough larger fish out there. The other thing that's helped too is that they've finally been putting some limits on the menhaden fishery down in the Chesapeake, and we've starting to see those fish come back. Now that's a forage fish; it's a type of a herring, and everything feeds off of them, and so it's been beneficial across a number of species, including the bass.
Well, you mentioned the water is getting warmer, and one thing that seems to be happening is lobsters are moving north.
Right.
As I understand it, Connecticut, Long Island, even parts of Massachusetts are not getting the amount of lobsters, but Maine in the last 3 or 4 years has had very strong seasons. So some people say that lobsters are moving north because the water's getting warmer.
Yeah, they're species that been used to cold water of a certain temperature, and it's getting too warm south of the Cape. And so the population has shifted north. It's certainly benefited Maine, but as the oceans continue to absorb more heat as a result of climate change, even at some point the waters up in Maine will start to get too warm, and you'll see that population shift north into Canada and Nova Scotia. And
I was about to say that the Mainers are enjoying the moment, but they're aware that if they keep going north, they're going to be in Canada, and
Right.
Canada, among other things, has some subsidization to their fishing industry. So I'm sure the Canadian teams would be great, but Maine fishermen and lobstermen are quite concerned.
Sure.
Now, in terms of your organization, conversation. Spring is around the bend. I think you have an event coming up, Mike. Do you have something, I think in several weeks in March, that you're going to be
Right.
having an open meeting for people? Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. And on March 23rd at the Senior Community Center here in Newburyport at 10:30 to about noontime, we're running a program called Carbon Footprint 101. And basically what that program does is it's an informative program to help people understand what a carbon footprint is and how to figure out what your carbon footprint would be and what your impact is or your contribution is to climate change. Now, the city is working with Deborah Shepard, who's going to be presenting the program, to determine what Newburyport's municipal carbon footprint is. And it's sort of a starting point, right? So if you're going to make changes to how you generate electricity, what you use for fuel and heating and so on and so forth, you need to know where you're starting from, right? And then you measure it every number of years or every year to see, what kind of progress you're making. And part of that is also figuring out what is the residential component of that, because people can manage their households. They can look at, what am I running from light bulbs and what am I using for cars and how do I use them and that sort of thing. These are all things that factor into your carbon footprint. And once you look at it in terms of numbers, it's like, anything else, like managing your checkbook. Well, if we cut here and cut there, we balance things out, right?
So that's March 23rd
Right.
in the morning. It's a Saturday. It's here at the Senior Citizen Center.
Yep.
In the couple minutes we have left, do you have maybe a couple ideas that you can talk about how the average person in a town like Newburyport, can help in terms of, just climate change, and are there small ways that individuals can help at this point?
Sure. I mean, you have to look within your own lives. If you look at the big picture, in the United States, 66% of the carbon CO2 we put in the atmosphere comes from sources of generating electricity and also transportation. So if you look at your life from that perspective, how do I use my car? How do I use transportation? And how can I be more efficient with that? That's one area to cut down. Certainly, like in my family, we replaced one gas-powered car with an electric vehicle based on my wife's driving habits. It made a lot of sense, and that dramatically reduced our carbon footprint. We also put solar panels on the roof to cut into that electricity generation factor of the carbon footprint, and that dropped it further. So that those solar panels power the car and they power the house. And then, when you start looking and asking those questions, you discover other things. You discover there are tax benefits to doing certain things and refunds and so forth. Certainly, everybody knows about light bulbs and that sort of thing, and insulating your house. And Mass Save is a free program where you can have the state come in and do an energy audit for you and make recommendations as to what you can do to save money on your heating costs and electrical usage.
Well, Mike, those are good suggestions. And again, I'm with Mike Morris of Storm Surge. One point I like to talk about a little bit, and you mentioned this, and sometimes the water is cleaner than others here in the river and near the ocean. And Paul Hogg, who is the harbor master here in Newburyport, when I asked him recently about the effluent in the water, he said, well, those things do happen, but we were very encouraged a year or two ago when they were able to open the clam flats for the first time in decades. And he said, this was just a great thing for everyone's morale, if nothing else.
Right.
Now, I should point out that any clam taken in this area goes to a purifier, regardless of how clean the water might be.
Right.
And there has been a purifying plant on Plum Island for decades. But I thank Paul for that insight. And some days were better than others. I know, as you pointed out, 3 or 4 decades ago, parents wouldn't let their kids near the water, the river, for fear they'd fall in.
Right.
Things are getting better now, however, and so I think we can look forward to, some good days and some bad.
Sure.
And you've pointed out a number of ways that we can all do better. Anything else that you would mention in the final seconds, Paul, about how we can help individually or maybe on a political level?
Yeah, sure. I mean, right now the United States is lacking political will to deal with climate change, and there are huge economic opportunities for American business to make money from climate change and prosper through new technology, but we're not seeing government support in that. So I would say make sure you vote in 2020, and let's start tackling this problem. So that's probably the most important thing you can do. And then in the interim, start looking at ways how you can lead a cleaner life and be more efficient.
Well, Mike, this has been great. I learned a lot. I covered the waterfront and City Hall in Newburyport for 5 or 6 years, but I learned a great deal today. So I want to thank you very much. I want to mention that you're having an event March 23rd, and we meet here every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And so we look forward to seeing and listening and talking to you folks again. We talk about the river, we talk about the ocean, we talk about the future of the environment here. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll be back next Tuesday. And Mike Morris, thank you very much again.
Thank you.